Most people think the Battle of Marathon was Greece versus Persia. They're completely wrong about what it really was. 490 BC, a small city-state on the edge of the ancient world stood between a god-king's empire and the total erasure of an idea that had barely even taken root: democracy. You've heard the story. The outnumbered Greeks won. A soldier ran 26 miles. Everyone cheered. But here's what that version leaves out: the betrayals, the political gambits, the men who almost handed Athens to Persia on purpose, and the single tactical decision that changed the trajectory of Western civilization forever. Most people walk away from this story thinking it was a clean, heroic moment. It wasn't. It was messy, it was complicated, and some of the most important parts of it were deliberately buried by the very people who benefited from the version we were handed. By the end of this, you'll never see Marathon the same way again. Not the battle, not the heroes, not the so-called triumph of democracy. Because the closer you look at what actually happened on that plain in 490 BC, the more the clean story starts to crack. And what's underneath is far more interesting than anything you learned in school. Here's the story most of us were taught, and it's worth laying it out in full before we start pulling it apart, because the official version is actually a pretty good story on its own terms. It just isn't the whole one. By the late 6th century BC, the Persian Empire was the largest, most powerful political entity the world had ever seen. Under Cyrus the Great, then Cambyses, then Darius I, Persia had swallowed up Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and vast stretches of Central Asia. It wasn't just an empire. It was a bureaucratic, military, and cultural machine of staggering sophistication. Darius alone ruled over somewhere between 35 and 50 million people, which represented roughly half the world's population at the time. When Persia decided it wanted something, it generally got it. That's the context you need to hold in your mind before you hear what Athens did next. Because what Athens did was genuinely insane. In 499 BC, the Greek cities along the coast of Ionia, modern-day Western Turkey, rose up against Persian rule in what's known as the Ionian Revolt. These were Greek-speaking cities that had been under Persian control for decades. They'd had enough. They sent messengers to mainland Greece asking for help, and almost everyone said no. Sparta, the dominant military power in Greece, turned them away. Most city-states didn't want to poke the bear, but Athens sent 20 ships. Corinth sent 5. It wasn't a massive intervention, but it was enough to matter, and more importantly, it was enough to be noticed. The rebels, with Athenian support, marched inland and burned Sardis, the regional capital of the Persian satrap in Anatolia. It was one of the most important cities in the Western Persian Empire. The burning of Sardis was the kind of act that doesn't get forgotten at the imperial level. Darius, by all ancient accounts, was incandescent with rage. The story Herodotus gives us is that Darius asked who the Athenians were. Apparently he didn't know. And when he was told, he drew his bow, fired an arrow into the sky, and prayed to the gods for vengeance. Then he told a servant to remind him 3 times at every dinner, "Remember the Athenians." Whether that's literal history or Herodotus being Herodotus, the point it makes is accurate. Darius wanted Athens destroyed, not negotiated with, not absorbed. Destroyed. The Ionian Revolt was eventually crushed by 494 BC. The city of Miletus, the center of the rebellion, was sacked, and its population either killed or enslaved. The message was clear. This is what happens when you defy Persia. And then Darius turned his attention west. In 490 BC, he dispatched a naval expedition across the Aegean. The fleet was commanded by 2 generals, Datis and Artaphernes, the nephew of Darius himself. Ancient sources give wildly different numbers for the Persian force, ranging from 20,000 to 600,000, which tells you more about ancient record-keeping and propaganda than actual troop counts. Modern historians generally estimate somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 infantry, plus cavalry, plus the naval crews. It was still a massive force by the standards of the ancient world, and by any reasonable estimate, it dwarfed what Athens could put in the field. The Persians first stopped at the island of Naxos, which they sacked, then moved to Delos, the sacred island of Apollo, where, interestingly, Datis made offerings at the temple rather than destroying it. This was deliberate. The Persians were sending a message that they were not barbarian destroyers of holy places. They were civilized, legitimate rulers. Obey them, and your sacred sites would be respected. Resist, and you'd get what Naxos got. It was sophisticated imperial messaging, and it worked on several of the smaller Aegean islands, which submitted immediately. Then the fleet came to Euboea, the long island running parallel to the Greek mainland. The city of Eretria was one of the targets. Eretria had also sent ships to help the Ionian revolt, and after a siege of about a week, Eretria fell. Ancient sources say it fell because of internal betrayal, with two prominent citizens opening the gates. The city was burned, its population was rounded up and eventually settled deep inside Persian territory, near Susa, where their descendants reportedly still lived generations later.
And then the Persians sailed around the southern tip of Euboea and landed on the plain of Marathon.
Marathon is a coastal plain about 25 miles northeast of Athens. It's roughly 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, bounded by mountains to the west and the sea to the east. The Persian forces came ashore, set up camp, unloaded their horses, and waited. And the Athenians, hearing the news, called a general assembly, voted to march out and meet them, and sent a runner named Phidippides to Sparta to beg for help. Phidippides ran approximately 150 miles to Sparta in about 2 days, which is remarkable on its own terms. The Spartans said they wanted to help, but couldn't march until the full moon. They were in the middle of a religious festival, the Carneia, and their laws forbade military movement during sacred periods. Or so they said. We'll come back to that. So Athens marched out alone. Well, almost alone. The small city of Plataea sent its entire fighting force, somewhere around 1,000 men, to stand with Athens. It was a gesture of solidarity that the Athenians never forgot and always honored. But in practical terms, the Greek force at Marathon numbered somewhere around 10 to 11,000 hoplites, against what was, by any estimate, a significantly larger Persian army with the added advantage of cavalry. The Athenian generals were divided. There were 10 generals, each commanding a tribal regiment, and a war archon named Callimachus, who held the tie-breaking vote. Half the generals wanted to wait, for Sparta, for better odds, for something. The other half, led by Miltiades, wanted to fight immediately. Miltiades argued that delay was dangerous, that the longer they waited, the worse the political situation in Athens would become. He went to Callimachus and made his case. Callimachus voted to fight. What happened next is one of the most analyzed military engagements in human history. The Greek hoplites charged, apparently at a run for at least part of the approach, which was unusual, and hit the Persian line. Miltiades had deliberately weakened the Greek center and strengthened the flanks. The Persians pushed through the center, exactly as planned, but both Greek flanks held and then swung inward. The Persians in the center suddenly found themselves surrounded on 3 sides. The battle turned into a rout. The Persians ran for their ships. The Greeks pursued them to the water's edge and managed to capture 7 Persian vessels before the fleet pulled away. Greek casualties: approximately 192 men killed, including Callimachus. Their names were recorded. They were buried on the battlefield in a burial mound called the Soros that still exists today. Persian casualties: Herodotus gives the number as 6,400. Whatever the exact count, the disparity was extraordinary. Then, and this is the part of the story everyone knows, a soldier ran back to Athens with the news. The historical sources are actually confused about this. Herodotus doesn't mention the famous death run. He mentions Phidippides running to Sparta. The story of the soldier gasping, "We have won," and dropping dead appears in later sources. It may be true. It may be embellished. It almost certainly got folded onto Phidippides in the popular retelling, even though Phidippides ran to Sparta days earlier. The marathon race we run today, 26.2 miles, is based on a story that the ancient sources themselves can't quite agree on. That's the textbook version. Clean, heroic. David versus Goliath. And in its broad strokes, it's accurate. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's where the questions that don't have comfortable answers start to surface. The Persian landing at Marathon was not a random or accidental choice. This is the first thing you need to understand, and it's the thread that, once you pull it, starts to unravel a great deal of the official story. The plain of Marathon had very specific geographic advantages from the Persian perspective. It was one of the only places near Athens where the Persian cavalry could operate effectively, cavalry being one of Persia's primary tactical advantages and one of Athens's greatest vulnerabilities. The Athenian army had virtually no cavalry of its own. On most of the terrain around Athens, that wouldn't matter much because the broken, rocky ground would neutralize horses anyway. But Marathon's open, flat plain was exactly the kind of ground where Persian horsemen could dominate, could sweep around flanks, could pursue a routed army, and turn a defeat into a massacre. Whoever chose Marathon chose it with detailed, expert knowledge of Attic geography and Persian military requirements. So who chose it? Herodotus, our primary source for all of this, dances around the question in a way that is itself revealing. He raises the possibility of collaboration and then steps back from it. He mentions the shield signal, a story we'll get to, and then declines to name names definitively. For a historian who was generally willing to spread gossip and speculation freely, this particular reticence is notable. It suggests he knew things he wasn't comfortable putting fully on the record, possibly because the families involved were still powerful in his own time. The family most consistently implicated in ancient sources is the Alcmaeonids. The Alcmaeonids were one of the oldest and most powerful aristocratic clans in Athens. They had been exiled at various points. They had complicated relationships with tyranny. Cleisthenes, who essentially designed Athenian democracy, was himself an Alcmaeonid, which tells you something about how aristocratic families navigated political change. And they had the kind of pan-Hellenic connections and foreign relationships that made collaboration with Persia not just conceivable, but strategically logical. Aristocratic families in the ancient world did not think in terms of national loyalty the way we do today. They thought in terms of family interest, clan survival, and the perpetuation of their own power. If the Persians were going to win anyway, it made sense to be on the right side of the Persians early. But it goes deeper than just geographic knowledge. The question of the shield signal is one of the most debated episodes in ancient historiography. After the battle was won and the Persian fleet began to sail south, toward Athens, ancient sources, including Herodotus, mention that a shield was raised on a hillside, flashing in the sunlight, apparently as a signal to the Persian fleet. The implication, which Herodotus leaves hanging in the air without resolving, is that someone was signaling the Persians that Athens was now undefended, that the army was still at Marathon, that the city was open. If the Persian fleet had arrived in Athens before the Greek army force marched back, the story of Marathon ends very differently. Athens falls. The people who arranged the signal presumably get rewarded. Democracy ends before it really begins. Herodotus says The shield was flashed. He says it was after the battle. He says it was seen. And then he essentially drops the subject, pivoting to a discussion of how quickly the Athenian army marched back. He mentions suspicion falling on the Alcmaeonids, and then spends several paragraphs defending them against the accusation, which, given that nobody seems to have been defending them against it particularly loudly in the text before this point, reads less like exoneration and more like managing a reputation. You don't write that much denying something unless the accusation has real weight. Now, here's the other dimension of Section 2 that doesn't get nearly enough attention: the days of inaction before the battle. The Greek forces arrived at Marathon and then essentially sat there for several days doing nothing. This period of paralysis is usually explained as waiting for Sparta, or as the generals being cautious, or as a sensible military holding action. And some of that is true. But the deadlock among the generals was not purely about military strategy. It was about politics. Athens in 490 BC was less than 20 years into its democratic experiment. The reforms of Cleisthenes had only been passed in 508/507 BC. Before that, Athens had been governed by tyrants, the Peisistratid dynasty, and before that, by aristocrats. The shift to democracy was real, but it was also recent, contested, and fragile. There were plenty of people inside Athens who had personal or ideological reasons to prefer a different outcome at Marathon. Not necessarily because they loved Persia, but because a Persian victory might topple the democratic system they resented and restore the kind of oligarchic or tyrannical arrangement that served their interests better. The Peisistratids, the former tyrant family of Athens, were, according to Herodotus, actually traveling with the Persian expedition. Hippias, the elderly former tyrant of Athens who had been expelled in 510 BC, was on the Persian fleet. He was the one who guided them to Marathon. His family had used Marathon as a landing site in their own rise to power generations earlier. He was, in the most literal sense, a traitor to Athens, a Greek man helping a foreign empire attack his home city in order to restore himself to power. And he wasn't alone. He had supporters inside Athens, people who corresponded with him, people who would benefit from his return. So when the Greek generals sat frozen in their deadlock for days, some of them may not have been merely cautious. Some of them may have been waiting for an outcome, not a plan. The debate wasn't just, should we fight now or later? It was, for at least some voices around that table, something closer to, do we actually want to win this? That is not the story that gets told in schools, but it's the story the evidence points toward. And the fact that it doesn't get told, that the official version smooths it over into a simple tale of courage versus fear, is itself part of the story, because the people who won at Marathon controlled the narrative of Marathon, and they had every reason to make the story as clean and heroic as possible, scrubbing out the parts where their own society nearly handed itself to the enemy voluntarily. One more thing in this layer that almost never surfaces: the role of money. Persian imperial expansion wasn't purely military. Persia was extraordinarily sophisticated in the use of financial incentives to undermine opponents. They subsidized political factions. They bought influence. They funded exiles. The idea that Persian gold was flowing into Athenian political circles before Marathon is not paranoid speculation. It's consistent with documented Persian practice in other theaters, and it's implied by the pattern of political behavior inside Athens in the years leading up to the battle. The question isn't whether Persian money influenced Athenian politics. The question is, how much, and whose hands it passed through. Now let's talk about the people themselves, because the figures at the center of this story are far more complicated and far more interesting than the marble statue versions that history handed us. Start with Miltiades, because Miltiades is the hero of Marathon in almost every account, and his heroism is real. But his biography is so strange and morally complicated that it should fundamentally change how we understand his motivations at Marathon, and yet it almost never comes up. Miltiades was not a simple Athenian patriot. He was a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades living inside the Persian imperial system, operating as a client ruler under Persian authority. His father, Simon, had established a kind of mini-kingdom in the Thracian Chersonese, the long peninsula that forms the northern shore of the Hellespont, modern-day Gallipoli. Miltiades inherited this position and ruled it, and his rule was, by ancient standards, basically a tyranny. He was a monarch of a small territory that operated within the Persian sphere of influence. He wasn't a subject exactly, but he wasn't independent either. He owed his position to the tolerance of Persian power. He served, or at least nominally participated, in Darius's Scythian campaign around 513 BC, in which Persian forces crossed the Danube chasing the Scythians and nearly came to disaster. There's a famous and possibly legendary episode in which the Greek client rulers, including Miltiades, were left guarding a bridge over the Danube while Darius chased the Scythians north. The Scythians came to the Greeks and asked them to destroy the bridge, trap Darius north of the river, and end Persian power in Europe. Miltiades, according to Herodotus, argued for doing exactly that. The others overruled him, kept the bridge, and Darius came back. Whether this story is literally true or is retrospective myth-making to explain why Miltiades hated Persia so much, the core biographical fact is undeniable. Miltiades spent years embedded in the Persian imperial world, watching it operate from the inside, understanding its military culture, its tactical habits, its bureaucratic logic. When the Ionian Revolt broke out and the Persians began reasserting control, Miltiades understood exactly what was coming. The Persians were going to settle accounts across the region, and his autonomous position in the Chersonese was not going to survive that process. He fled, first to Imbros and then to Athens, arriving around 493 BC, just a few years before Marathon. He arrived not as a returning hero, but as a refugee, and, in some quarters, as a suspect. He was put on trial in Athens for his tyrannical rule in the Chersonese. He was acquitted, but the trial itself tells you something. Athens was not sure whether to trust him. So when Miltiades stood before the generals at Marathon and argued passionately for immediate engagement, his passion was not purely civic. It was existential. If Persia won, Miltiades was a dead man. He had fled Persian territory. He had opposed Persian authority, at least by the end. He had no diplomatic cover, no family connection to the Persian court, no path to accommodation. He needed Athens to win at Marathon because the alternative for Miltiades personally was death or slavery. That's not a criticism of him. It's a fully human motivation. But it's a dimension of his argument that should be factored into how we understand it. He also came with something none of the other generals had: genuine inside knowledge of how Persian armies fight. He had watched them operate. He understood their tactical tendencies, their reliance on cavalry, their assumption that a numerically superior force would naturally drive through a weaker center. The double envelopment he designed, weakening the center, massing the flanks, letting the Persians push through and then closing around them, wasn't just clever. It was designed by someone who knew exactly what the Persian commanders would do when they saw a thin Greek center, because he had watched Persian commanders make that calculation before. Marathon was Miltiades deploying insider knowledge against the system that had hosted him. That's a fascinating thing to sit with. The hero of the battle was a man whose biography was inseparable from the empire he defeated. Now Callimachus, the war archon, the tie-breaking vote, the man Miltiades lobbied most intensely. Callimachus voted to fight. He commanded the right wing of the Greek line. He died in the battle, and because he died, he left no record of his own thinking, no memoir, no version of events. We have only Miltiades' version of the conversation, filtered through Herodotus, in which Miltiades gives a rousing speech about freedom and slavery and the glory of Athens, and Callimachus is moved to make the right choice. It's a great speech. It reads almost too cleanly. The man it convinced died before he could clarify what actually persuaded him. History is written by survivors. Callimachus is a reminder of what we lose when the people at the center of events don't survive to push back against the narrative. Then there's Themistocles. He was present at Marathon. He commanded one of the tribal regiments. He was politically active in Athens throughout this period and would go on to become the dominant Athenian statesman of the next 2 decades. But at Marathon, he's a background figure, mentioned in passing, given no particular heroic role. The glory of Marathon belonged to Miltiades and, posthumously, to Callimachus. Themistocles watched. What Themistocles took away from Marathon was not what most people think. He didn't take away Greece can defeat Persia on land. He took away something much more strategic and much more farsighted. Persia will come back. They always come back. And when they come back, it won't be 20,000 soldiers. It'll be 200,000. The army that won at Marathon, however brilliant its tactics, cannot hold against that. The only thing that can hold against the full weight of the Persian Empire is naval power, because naval power allows Greece to fight on terms it chooses rather than terms Persia chooses. In the years after Marathon, Themistocles fought a sustained and frequently vicious political campaign to redirect Athenian resources from land defense to shipbuilding. He argued, cajoled, manipulated, and maneuvered. He used the discovery of a rich silver vein at Laurion, silver that would normally have been distributed as a dividend to Athenian citizens, to fund the construction of 200 triremes. It was one of the most consequential political decisions in Greek history, and Themistocles had to fight for it against fierce opposition, including from people who thought the victory at Marathon proved that hoplites were all Athens needed. He was right. When Persia came back in 480 BC under Xerxes, with an army that made the Marathon expedition look like a scouting party, it was the Athenian navy that broke Persian power at Salamis. Marathon made that possible, but only because Themistocles stood in its shadow, learning lessons nobody else was willing to learn. And then there is Hippias, the old Athenian tyrant who sailed with the Persian fleet, who guided them to Marathon, who stood on that beach in his 80s, watching the army he'd helped bring there, prepare to restore him to the city of his birth. Herodotus gives us a strange, melancholy detail. On the morning the Persian forces landed, Hippias sneezed so violently that a tooth fell out and landed in the sand. He searched for it, couldn't find it, and said to himself, "This land is not ours. The only share of it my tooth shall have." He interpreted this as a sign that his hopes were over. He was right. He died not long after, presumably of old age, before the battle was even fully resolved, and Athens never fell to his manipulation. But the fact that he was there, that an Athenian man who had ruled Athens for 17 years was standing on Attic soil, helping a foreign empire attack his homeland, is something the triumphalist narrative of Marathon always has to paper over quickly. Because Hippias isn't an aberration. He's a reminder that in this period, the line between Greek patriot and collaborator was not a clean moral boundary, but a political calculation made by people with complicated interests and no certainty about who was going to win. Every hero story needs a villain, but the most honest histories understand that the villains often look a lot like the heroes. Same culture, same language, same gods, same family backgrounds, and are separated from them by circumstance, opportunity, and the accident of which side happened to prevail.